Everyone forgets one important thing about Counselor Troi in Star Trek Generations' controversial Enterprise destruction. When Star Trek Generations premiered in 1994, it was supposed to be a triumphant cinematic handoff between the original series and the next generation. Instead, it became a flashpoint for controversy. The destruction of the USS Enterprise D, the sleek, beloved Galaxy-class starship that had carried Picard and his crew through 7 seasons of exploration, left fans divided. Some felt it was a bold narrative stroke. Others saw it as an unnecessary, almost disrespectful way to discard a ship that had become an icon. Much has been written about Captain Picard's grief, William Riker's command under pressure, and Data's emotional breakdown thanks to his new emotion chip. But there's one aspect of that sequence fans often overlook. Counselor Deanna Troi was at the helm when the Enterprise crashed. And that fact reframes the entire moment in ways people rarely acknowledge. Troi wasn't supposed to be flying the ship. The bridge crew of the Enterprise D had well-defined roles. Troi was the ship's counselor, responsible for guiding the captain, mediating conflict, and supporting the crew's mental health. She wasn't trained to fly the ship like a seasoned helmsman. The actual helm station was usually occupied by officers like Wesley Crusher, Ensign Rowe, or any number of operations specialists. But when the Duras sisters' bird of prey crippled the Enterprise with their cloaking trick, chaos ensued. The main crew was scattered. After the warp core breach forced evacuation of the drive section, Troi ended up at the helm in the saucer. She had no choice. Someone had to steer, and many of the most qualified officers were already dead, injured, or directing damage control. That moment, when Troi reluctantly took control, is critical. Fans often mock the crash as Troi wrecking the Enterprise, as if it were a blunder. But the reality is that she prevented something far worse. Without her, the saucer section might never have reached Viridian 3 intact enough to save anyone on board. The crash wasn't a failure, it was a survival. It's easy to remember the spectacular visuals of the saucer's fiery descent and the jarring sight of the Enterprise's bridge exploding around the crew. But it's important to consider what was at stake. The warp core breach had already destroyed the star drive section. Thousands of lives in the saucer were seconds away from obliteration. Troi's only option was to bring the ship into controlled descent. Controlled is the key word. Yes, the crash was rough, but the ship stayed intact enough for most of the crew to survive. Troi maneuvered a crippled, powerless saucer, essentially a giant metal frisbee falling out of orbit, and landed it without killing everyone on board. That isn't incompetence. That's a miracle under impossible conditions. Had Riker or Data been at the helm, the landing may not have been any smoother. The ship had no warp drive, no main power, no shields, and limited maneuverability. A crash was inevitable. Troi simply managed to make it survivable. The gendered lens of criticism. Part of why Troi's role in the destruction of the Enterprise gets misremembered is because of how female characters in science fiction have historically been treated. Fans and critics were quick to joke that the ship crashed because the counselor was driving. The line even became a tongue-in-cheek joke among cast members. But behind that humor lies something more troubling. Troi wasn't given the same respect as her peers. Had Riker or Geordi been at the helm, the scene would likely be remembered as a moment of desperate heroism against overwhelming odds. Because it was Troi, fans too often frame it as incompetence or comic relief. This double standard underscores how Star Trek itself often sidelined Troi in the early seasons, relegating her to vague empathic insights and emotional commentary. By the time Generations came out, Marina Sirtis had fought hard to carve Troi into a fuller, stronger character. The saucer crash sequence, ironically, could have been remembered as her most heroic act. Instead, it's too often reduced to a punchline. What the scene really means. The destruction of the Enterprise D wasn't about failure, it was about transition. The filmmakers wanted to make space for the Sovereign-class Enterprise E that would debut in First Contact. The crash itself was symbolic, a way to show the next generation crew moving into a new phase of their journey. Troi's role fits perfectly into that symbolism. She embodied what Star Trek, the next generation, was really about: cooperation, adaptability, and trust. A character trained for psychology, not piloting, stepped into a life or death role.